In early July of 2020, I was scrolling Twitter and saw that Rolling Stone published an article about a new biopic that was in the works about the Beatles manager Brian Epstein. The film was called Midas Man and the timing was impeccable. I was in lockdown and to keep myself busy, I had decided to create a YouTube channel, and the first video that I wanted to make was going to be me assessing the many Beatle and Beatle adjacent biopics, and how fun that I'd now be able to tease that there would soon be a new one on the way. There's also a film that's going to be starting production next year about the Beatles manager Brian Epstein. My initial assumption was that Midas Man would be out in maybe roughly 18 months. So imagine my surprise when it actually took 4 long years until I got to see the bloody thing. And most people still aren't able to. Why did it take so long to come out? And what did I think of it? These are the 2 big questions I want to answer in this video. Because for all the promise that Midas Man initially harbored, the film found itself in a kind of production hell. I had already assumed this was the case, as evident in my video from April 2024, where I discussed the then recently announced official Beatle biopics coming out in 2027. Pretty rough time over at the Midas Man camp, I think is kind of fair to say. But the chaos behind the production of Midas Man was confirmed in an article released by Variety in January of this year titled, "Inside the Nightmare Production of Indie Film About Beatles Manager Brian Epstein." Quote, "I wish I'd never heard the words Midas Man. Dear oh dear, that doesn't sound good at all." So before I review this film, I am going to need to break down the clusterfuck that was the making and release of Midas Man, because so much of what I have to say about this movie can be reflected in the chaotic behind the scenes process. And it goes without saying that the details of this process are all taken from the aforementioned Variety article written by KJ Yossman. And if you'd like a more in-depth understanding of all the drama that went on, please do read her article. I'll link it in the description. And I just quickly wanted to say that I've recently lowered the cost to join my Patreon, where you can now watch the nearly 50 bonus videos I have on there for just $4 a month. I've made one on the many references to the Beatles in animation.
Right on the refrigerator.
There's one on my other favorite music from the 1960s, my breakdown of the Oasis versus Blur Britpop battle, and lots more. I mean, you can see the list right here. And hey, you can literally just join for 1 month, watch everything you want, and then leave. There's nothing that locks you in. Make it work for you. But I do want to add that because my channel uses a ton of copyrighted film footage and music especially, I am constantly playing Russian roulette with getting demonetized. So Patreon is the main way my channel stays afloat. So if you watch my videos regularly and believe that the effort that I put in is worth the price of a cup of coffee, please consider supporting. And if you're feeling extra generous, you can join the higher tier where you get to vote on the topics for the bonus video or even pick them yourself. The link to join my Patreon is in the description. There has never been a better time to join. I hope you consider it. But for now, I'm gonna summarize why the Brian Epstein movie was a, quote, total fucking mess. So back in early 2019, UK production company Studio Pow were approached by an independent creative team who offered up a script for a Brian Epstein biopic. Studio Pow dug the script and were keen to get investors involved, so in November 2019, they threw a party at the BAFTA headquarters in London to do exactly that. Perry Travers, the CEO of Studio Pow, was one of the key producers and apparently told the crowd of potential investors, quote, "We genuinely have the team and the cast, and it's a story which has been a long time in the telling." It turns out he most definitely did not have the team or the cast, but the story was a long time in the telling. Brian Epstein was a man who led a turbulent life, battling to keep his closeted homosexuality and Jewish background a secret, whilst also managing the biggest band in history before dying of an accidental overdose at the age of 32. It was a story ripe for the silver screen. And if the producers could manage to get a hold of the rights to the Beatles songs, then one could only imagine how popular this film could be. Oh, and just regarding the pronunciation of his last name, I know it's a hotly contested debate always, but from the research that I've done on the matter, I've deduced that Brian's family always pronounced it Epstein, but according to Beatles historian Mark Lewison, around the age of 21, Brian began to insist his name was pronounced Epstein. There's audio evidence of John Lennon pronouncing it that way.
Brian was a beautiful guy, Brian Epstein. But
then again, George Harrison said Epstein and Get Back.
Ever since Mr. Epstein passed away, it's never been the same.
But I'd say the final word on the matter is from the documentary The Beatles, The First US Visit, where Brian can be heard saying, albeit quietly, Epstein.
The girls in best wishes. Brian Epstein.
But honestly, I think both pronunciations are totally valid. I really don't think it matters that much. This is more to prevent the barrage of complaints in the comments. On with the video. Now, the first snag was the creative team behind the screenplay and Studio Pow parting ways, allegedly due to how intensely the producers were approaching investors. Now, without a script, Travers eventually commissioned an entertainment journalist and a freelance writer to come up with a screenplay of their own. With initial investors now cashing checks, the film still needed a director, which they found in Jonas Åkerlund, the Swedish filmmaker behind movies like like Lords of Chaos, and also Paul McCartney's Live Kisses DVD from 2012.
The sound of place.
Mostly the director had experience with music videos, and not too long into the process, there was tension between him and the studio, seemingly due to the director not properly being informed of the modest $10 million budget.
To be honest, this is the first I hear of this.
According to the article, this is disputable, so take it with a grain of salt. Same with the direction that Okerlund apparently wanted to take the film in, who apparently envisioned a fairly adult-themed biopic with rough sex scenes.
If you want your, average video, I'm probably not your guy.
Whereas the studio was aiming for a, quote, movie which would be more universal. While the relationship between director and producers fractured more intensely, casting for the film turned out to be just as difficult, with Studio Power allegedly having unrealistic expectations of the kind of actors they could wrangle, like Florence Pugh for the role of Cilla Black,
What?
one of Brian Epstein's other artists.
I won't do it.
A source described the process as, quote, torturous. Eventually, the role of Brian went to not Dominic Cooper, as was originally negotiated, but actor from The Queen's Gambit, Jacob Fortune Lloyd. Now, this is around the point in 2020 where I read the Rolling Stone article announcing the film was happening, and here's where I need to admit something to you all. It's a bit of a plot twist. I auditioned for Midas Man. It really wasn't a big deal. So, okay, I read that article, and I read that casting was going to be done by a guy named Dan Hubbard. And so on a quick Google search, I found his contact information and sent through a video of me as Paul and also as George. I was really debating whether or not to keep this tidbit in or not, but it's too good not to share with you all. Because I don't know if many of you know this, but I am an actor. Like, I trained when I was younger. I got my Bachelor of Performing Arts. I've appeared in the odd TV show and commercial.
It's him. He lured me here.
But for something like this, I definitely wasn't expecting to hear back. But I did! And I was told that it was still early days and that pre-production probably wasn't happening until January 2021. So I then emailed back in February 2021 to inquire again and was told that it was still not financed. Okay, but then out of nowhere, in May of 21, I was sent an email asking me to audition for the role of Paul McCartney. Now, by this point in time, my YouTube channel had taken off, and I had been told by many people how much I looked like George Harrison, so reading for Paul was kind of unexpected. I was then sent my audition scene as well as the entire script, which I thought was a little bit odd. Like, that doesn't normally happen when you audition for a film, that you get the entire screenplay, but all that's to say, I have had the full script for Midas Man in my possession since mid-2021. The audition scene, if you are curious, was where the Beatles meet Brian in his office for the first time, and I thought I did alright, but ultimately I never heard back. I sure do hope I wasn't part of what made the casting process torturous. I just wanted to add that I'm very grateful to have been given the chance to audition for this film. I'm not making this video because I have an axe to grind or anything. I'm making it because I ultimately ended up becoming a YouTuber who talks about the Beatles, and to not mention this film or the very notable fact that I auditioned for it would feel inauthentic. So look, no hard feelings, but I am going to keep going now. Then a few months later, in November 2021, Deadline released an article detailing the lead cast for the film, including promotional shots of the 4 guys playing the Beatles. Obviously, none of them were me, so I knew I hadn't scored the role. Oh well, I had the Beatles Get Back video to make at that point, so I was keeping busy. I wasn't too crushed. Now, the guys they did cast, I thought looked pretty good. A lot of people online got really bent out of shape at the historical inaccuracies of the images with questionable wigs and inauthentic equipment like the orange amps, but many people also didn't realize that these weren't stills from the films. These were in fact just promotional shots to suggest what the film might look like once it gets going. But look, I get the nitpicking. That was also my reaction as well. I even made a Patreon video reacting to these images like way back in 2021. I'll return to my thoughts on the casting in the next section, but now let's return to pre-production, where the first director finally decided to part ways with the film, but due to NDAs, has only said, quote, "The project did not turn out the way I thought. That's all I can really say." Okerlund was replaced by vinyl director Sarah Sugarman, where principal photography was meant to resume within weeks. However, there was still the issue of the film having basically no money, which meant that Sugarman couldn't start work on Midas Man for a further 3 months, and in the meantime, the rest of the cast were left in limbo, not knowing if their services would be needed. Some like Lucas Gage and Rosie Day dropped out of the film, presumably for this reason. All the while, email blasts were still being sent out from now defunct websites to potential investors with the subject line, line, invest in the biggest movie of 2022. Did you hear that, Avatar and Top Gun? You're about to be bested by the Brian Epstein biopic. Sugarman was finally able to commence shooting in January 2022, but with a new producer on board whose son wanted to make the film's budget as lean as possible, this replacement director could not agree with the producers and swiftly exited the project, but not before allegedly being paid, quote, an absolute fortune, according to the source in Variety. So, with only 15% of usable footage in the can, Joe Stevenson was brought on as the third director to complete the film.
And just FYI, when a movie requires 3 consecutive directors to finish out its production, it's almost always a sign that things are going pretty damn terribly.
At this point, the total budget had blown past $18 million. Another huge issue was that many investors seemed to be under the impression that the film would involve music from the Beatles catalogue. The only problem was that neither Apple Corps nor Sony Music Publishing agreed to this. Not being able to acquire any Beatles music really had a stunting effect on the momentum of the film, with one major streamer turning it down for this reason. Ultimately, it was low-profile distributor Briarcliff that agreed to take on the film. Now, Briarcliff has developed a reputation for taking on projects that no one else will touch, such as the Donald Trump biopic The Apprentice. However, since that Variety article was published, Briarcliff have made it clear that they are no longer involved in the film. So we now have a big, gaping distribution hole. More on that in a minute. There are other crazy additions to this story as well, like when one investor was promised that their son, a musician, could play Paul McCartney, and after auditioning, had been told he had won the role. Then, after spending months learning how to play the bass left-handed, the musician found out that the part had been recast with actor Blake Richardson. Ay, ay, ay. Also, Variety doesn't even outline how and where COVID delayed production, which I'm sure would have been a massive headache. My favorite line from the article is where it states, quote, "Of the many people involved in Midas Man that Variety spoke to for this story, the word nightmare came up more than once." And said one person involved in the production, quote, "I swear to God, I was just like, I wish I'd never heard the words Midas Man ever." I mean, I wish I could say that was the worst of it, but that was just the making of the damn film. I haven't even got to the completely ballsed up release rollout. So in July 2024, a random YouTube channel somehow got a hold of the trailer to Midas Man and just uploaded it before any production company was able to, and like totally absorbed all of the views for it as well. And you know, I've been following this film's journey, so I was pretty quick on the draw. I downloaded the trailer, I uploaded it to Twitter and was like, hey, it's crazy that this was leaked. And then one of the writers of the screenplay commented asking me to take it down, which I did. Like, come on, I didn't want to be the cause of any more stress on their part. But I was also kind of puzzled, like, not to toot my own horn, but no one's gonna get the word out about this film better than the only guy that's been talking about it since its inception. Like, you're throwing away free publicity here. And then finally, I found out the release date for Midas Man was going to be August 29th, 2024. But weirdly, that was just the date for a limited early release in Australia.
G'day.
Which is just so crazy. Like, I'm always looking at the UK and especially America in envy, because you guys always get everything before the rest of the world. But no, this time it's little old Elliot down in Melbourne who got first dibs. Suck it. They actually held numerous advanced screening sessions like a week earlier on August 21st. To my knowledge, there was no actual premiere or anything like that, so I jumped at the chance to see it before even its proper Australian release date. When I went, I would say that my cinema was probably about 15% full, if that. It was mostly just older people who probably just felt like a night out at the movies, and this just happened to be on, like that was the vibe. No other major Beatles fans that I could see. It was so weird. After seeing it, I logged my review on Letterboxd, where I realized I was literally the second person ever to review this film on the app. The person who reviewed it first beat me by like a matter of hours. I mean, doesn't that just sound correct? Like, my very strange journey with this film continues, I guess. But sadly, Midas Man never got a theatrical release in either the UK or the US. Like, that sucks, bro. What happened? Like, wasn't this supposed to be the biggest film of 2022? For a while, depending on your region, you could buy it as a download on a nascent media distribution website called Olin, but now I believe it's finally found its home on Amazon Prime and Apple TV, where you can either rent or buy it. But still not in the US. Like, at the time of filming this, it's February 13th, and right now, there is no legal way for people in America to watch this film, or most other countries for that matter.
Just amending that last comment, it does seem like you can buy it from Olin if you're in the US for, I believe, $11.97, although you will have to sign up with your email and phone number for an account. The other way of watching Midas Man if you're in America is to purchase the Blu-ray from Amazon.com. So, yeah, good stuff.
So yeah, Fair to say that the process of making and releasing Midas Man was a total and utter clusterfuck. Now to finally get to my review. And to begin with, I'm going to discuss my thoughts on the casting choices, because when it comes to biopics, that is always the thing that people jump to first. Okay, Jacob Fortune Lloyd as Brian Epstein. I thought he did a pretty good job, given the multitude of problems that befell this movie. The actor is Jewish himself, although definitely has more of an olive-skinned complexion than the real Brian, but I don't think that matters all that much. His physicality is pretty spot on though, like around label heads he's quite stiff and awkward, but around women he's more fluid and at ease, which seems in keeping with the real Brian. I did think he could posh up his voice a little bit, like the real Brian had a very posh English accent, like not a trace of Liverpool to be found.
So I've been interested in the theatre and acting for a long time.
And they write their own songs. Really, really good songs, and there's lots more coming.
And Fortune Lloyd's was still fancy, but not quite where it should have been in my opinion, but that is a fairly minor quibble, and could have been a director's choice. Any of the three of them. Ultimately, I thought he did well, and further critiques would be towards the script and direction, and again, the overall chaotic production. When interviewed by the Times of London, the actor discussed the difficulty of going through multiple directors on the project, saying that, quote, "to lose momentum was hard." So I feel for the guy, he definitely deserved better. As did the four young lads playing the Beatles. Because one of the bright spots of this film is seeing these four guys all interact as John, Paul, George, and Ringo. Right off the bat, one of the best decisions casting-wise was making sure these four dudes were age appropriate. The Beatles are depicted here from 1961 to 67, and all four of these actors were in their early to mid-20s when they were cast, which lines up perfectly with how old the Beatles were. In so many Beatle or Beatle-adjacent biopics, the Fab Four are too often played by men in their 30s and sometimes 40s. Lennon naked, I'm looking at you. So it was really great to finally see age-appropriate actors in these roles. Beginning with John, I'll say that Jonah Lees definitely has somewhat of a likeness to the real John Lennon. Like his eyes have that kind of far-off look that John had, and his teeth also reminded me a bit of John's. He was also able to channel Lennon's wicked sense of humor where the script allowed it as well.
May I come in?
Oh, if you do want another slab to come out.
Leo Harvey Elliot as George also did a nice job at playing what I consider to be the trickiest Beatle to portray. He's got that kind of heavy brow, bitchy stare down that George himself had, and was also super skinny like the real George Harrison. His voice was pretty decent too.
Well, it's a good point though. Why are we appearing with all these greats? Well, our fans won't even be in the audience.
Like, that's not bad, but hey, also, side note, can we fucking light these actors? Like, where are the goddamn gaffers on this film? I also love that they've got this guy to play Liam Gallagher on 2 separate occasions now.
Till the day you fucking die.
Including Better Man, where he absolutely killed it as the Oasis member.
If I orgasmed every time I had a number one, I'd be fucking dry.
Side note, Better Man, what a bloody excellent film. Let me know in the comments if you're keen to see a video, because in my opinion, maybe the best music biopic we've had since Love and Mercy. Anyway, then we've got Campbell Wallace as Ringo Starr, who did fine.
I just wanted to come and say, best of luck, Cyril.
Oh, bugger off, Ringo.
He's not featured all that much, but I like his energy as Ringo, and he looked somewhat similar to Starr, but again, the drummer had a very distinct look, so it's always going to be tricky casting, you know? And finally, my, and I think many others' standout Beatle portrayal was Blake Richardson as Paul McCartney. This guy really did a swell job. First of all, he looks the most like the person he's portraying, which really helped, right down to the drawn-on eyebrows and black hair.
Parlophone made comedy. You know, a rock and roll band, not the Goons.
He didn't go too over the top with the Paul vocal impression and kept it kind of understated.
And the thing is, if you want us to answer like showbiz personalities, then we'll do that, you know. But I think it's better for us and better for everyone else if we answer honestly, even though we might not be right, you know, all the time.
His overall vibe was chill and charming, just like the real Paul, and his physicality was great, particularly in the musical performance scenes. Like, look at this shit, that's Paul McCartney! From the way he moved his head, to the way he held that Hofner bass, Richardson really nailed it, and I could only imagine what he'd be capable of in the hands of a director with a vision and a script that gave his character more depth. I truly hope he made it through at least a few rounds of casting for the upcoming Beatles biopics, because despite being an unknown, I see a lot more of McCartney in him than the rumored Paul Mescal. But that's a conversation for another time. However, the elephant in the room with these four guys, the obvious glaring issue here, is the height difference. In real life, John, Paul, and George were all within about an inch of each other, with McCartney being a hair taller than John, but both listed as 5'11", Harrison being 5'10", and Starr being approximately 5'7". Now, the heights of the actors in Midas Man aren't all listed online, but from what I could find, Blake Richardson is 6 foot, so only 1 inch taller than the real Paul, so that works fine. But then we look at the other actors, and Jonah Lees is, well, he's just a small guy. Like, he looks shorter than the real Ringo Starr, and he's playing John Lennon, for goodness sake. this wouldn't be too much of an issue, but his miniature stature is really emphasized by Leo playing George, who is approximately 8 feet tall. No, I'm only kidding. He probably looks closer to 6'3", 6'4", but the contrast with John just makes for a pretty absurd looking front line. It's as if George has been stretched and John's been shrunk down, eliminating a lot of the danger and edge that Lennon had. Campbell Wallace also appears quite lanky and taller than the real Ringo, but given he's sitting down for much of the film, it's not really an issue. I think this is like a funny monkey's paw outcome of Paul McCartney's issues with Nowhere Boy, where he complained about John being taller than him in the film when they're actually the same height in real life. Now, I think those two guys in Nowhere Boy are also more or less the same height. It's just that Aaron Taylor Johnson is just so much more buff than Thomas Brodie Sangster. And now with Midas Man, it's like the biggest overcorrection ever. What I will say for these guys is that they were able to capture a semblance of the Beatles' chemistry and spark, which is no small feat.
Eppie's on the slimming pills, the skinny minis, the perfect figure and staying up all night.
They are not given nearly as much to do as I'd hoped, but there is definitely a camaraderie between them all, and I can tell that they really wanted this to be good, and so I commend all 4 of them. Good job, guys. I don't commend the wigs, however. Man, you're getting some vintage Elliot Roberts right here, complaining about wigs and music biopics. I mean, look, they actually could have been far worse, and I think the early years are handled fine. I mean, Richardson actually looks like he's styling his real hair, and the others, I suppose, look forgivable. Although there is a change, and this might be because of the, years difference in filming, but Jonah Lee's wig goes from this kind of like copper color, similar to Leo's, and then at some point changes to this dark brown wig. Don't really know what happened there. But then in later years, like early 64, I think they tried to match George's hair to how he looked during the first US trip with that really short, blunt fringe. But then the sides and the back are just too long and straight, and it's got this kind of weird page boy pudding bowl appearance. Also, George never had hair that red. It's way too auburn in this film. And then by 67, all 4 of them are wearing what can only be described as shake and go wigs. I dug the costumes though, especially given the budget. They didn't look too bad. Outside of that, there's Adam Lawrence as Pete Best, who does well as the sack drummer. In fact, the scene where he's let go is probably done better here than any other Beatles biopic.
Just how the business is, I'm afraid. I'm so sorry.
The business?
Ringo's?
Ringo's. He's my friend.
Like, I actually really feel for Pete in this moment. God damn it, Midas Man, making me care about Pete Best. Now, he doesn't really resemble the guy all that much, and I felt crazy thinking this, but does he not actually look a lot like the guy that played Pete Best in both the John Lennon Story and Backbeat? Like, there's definitely a resemblance there, no? Anyway, probably my favorite casting choice, apart from Paul, was Charlie Palmer Rothwell, who played their producer, George Martin. Though a little young to be playing George, who was 36 when he met the Beatles, and Rothwell would have barely been 30, he has an incredible vocal likeness to George Martin's received pronunciation.
The old composers, Bach and Mozart, were always up to new sounds, new tricks. They were always looking for new instruments.
Bring them round when they're back from Hamburg, to our place in North London. It's just by Lord's, on the Abbey Road.
It wasn't just the accent either, it was the way he'd express that posh, mumbly tone that George Martin had.
They were still fairly irreverent even in those days, which I loved.
George, your rhythm is excellent, but maybe get a little bit more drive. I think that extra punch underneath will just help the vocal line soar.
Did you see what I mean? Like, these vocal inflections are really nuanced, and I've got to congratulate the guy on just locking in here and giving us a pretty great portrayal of George Martin. And the remainder of the cast were fine, like the 2 actors playing Epstein's parents were probably the most well-known of the bunch, and both did quite a good job. Darcy Shaw as Cilla Black was enjoyable. Now, the Beatles' first manager, Alan Williams, was 31 in 1961, but for some reason is being played by 60-year-old Eddie Izzard. Just a very odd casting choice. I'd say in the same vein of stunt casting, we have Jay Leno as Ed Sullivan, who looks and sounds absolutely nothing like the guy.
The Beatles! The Beatles!
But I guess because they were both late-night TV show hosts, it's meant to work. I don't know. Regardless of these actors' abilities, whether good or average, the film itself cannot really be saved from even the best performances because it is, well, just pretty boring. I'm sorry, I hate that I'm having to say this right now, but upon rewatch, this film is just a bit of a snoozer. Midas Man tells its tale chronologically, so we start in 1961 where Brian's already been to acting school and tried his hand at this and that, but ultimately feels like he's got more to offer than just working in his dad's shop. Where one day he hears about a local band that kids have been asking about in the Epstein-run record store. He heads down to the cavern to see a lunchtime performance and has a come to Jesus moment where he sees the Beatles playing for the first time. From there, he becomes their manager.
And I promise
I will look after you.
Gets them cleaned up, teaches them how to bow, scores a record deal, and as the band becomes uber mega famous and successful, Brian struggles to juggle two facets of his life he wishes to keep secret: his homosexuality and his Jewishness, in a time and place where it was difficult to be both. He also developed an increasing reliance on pills, which ultimately caused his death in 1967, which marks the end of the film. Although his death is not depicted in the film. Now, the reason I call this movie boring is because every time we get a moment with the Beatles, it's fun and enjoyable, but then we cut to yet... You right? You good? Bloody making so much noise. This is Martha, everyone. There you go, good girl. Now, the reason I call this movie boring is because every time we get a moment with the Beatles, it's fun and enjoyable, but then we cut to yet another dull meeting or family dinner of Brian's, and it's just like, I don't really care, I want to see what the Beatles are doing. And that may seem like a shallow criticism. I mean, after all, this is a Brian Epstein movie, not a Beatles movie, but the key issue I have here is that there's at least an identity, something to grasp onto with the Beatles. But when it comes to Brian's other relationships and inner turmoil, the film struggles to develop a point of view about the man and makes it hard to care about the other elements of his life that aren't the Fab Four. And as I said earlier, this is an incredibly fascinating person, someone who seems at odds with his own homosexuality, someone with his own bold aesthetic vision, but these features are explored with such a bland, surface-level approach that it makes me wonder why they even bothered making this film. Like, beyond getting them into suits and teaching them how to bow in unison, what exactly was Brian's role in the Beatles' success? Like, I know, but I am a deep fan of this history. What about people that don't have this knowledge? What must their understanding be of this person beyond telling the Beatles not to swear on stage? And instead of showing us how he managed the band through the tumultuous Beatlemania years, we instead get this low-rent walk-and-talk exposition where Brian narrates the flow of events from 64 through 66 in front of a green screen of archival footage. And in case it wasn't clear from the other clips that I've shown, but this is really where you can feel how cheap this movie is. Like, again, why bother continuing to pursue making this film when this is how you choose to depict some of the most exciting events in both Brian and the Beatles' lives? But even with a small budget, what's to stop the film from exploring Brian's homosexuality beyond the odd scene of him having a cheeky dalliance at the docks? Like, sure, he faced blackmail after someone threatened to expose him, but the stakes just don't feel as high as they should because we never get to the heart of who Brian really is. We don't really get to see what makes him tick, what he truly loves about the Beatles, why he believes in them. And don't get me started on the achingly dull relationship he has with a made-up character called Tex Ellington. If this movie really had some guts, it would have cut that storyline and lent way more into Brian's infatuation with John Lennon. Show us a glimpse of that trip the two of them took together in Spain. I mean, I know that movie literally already exists, but all I'm saying is that the potential for something richer, something more potent was right there for the taking, but they just squandered it. That may be the script, that may be the three different directors, but what it ultimately amounts to is a very lukewarm series of events that should be so much more exciting to watch than they actually are. Now, in terms of historical accuracy, despite the fairly milquetoast execution, this film is mostly pretty faithful to history, although there are some odd choices. Like when they play the royal variety performance in front of members of the monarchy, and John does his rattle your jewelry line, which Jonah Lee's nails, by the way. Like, every physical nuance and vocal inflection is perfect in that moment.
For our last number, I'd like to ask your help. The people in the cheaper seats, clap your hands. And the rest of you, if you just rattle your jewelry. Thank you. We'd like to sing a song called Twist and Shout.
But then, instead of launching into Twist and Shout, John Lennon then says,
We'd like to sing a song called Money.
Which I thought was pretty dumb. Like, neither song was written by an actual Beatles, so why not just do Twist and Shout anyway? Could you guys just not resist linking John Lennon's class commentary to a song called Money? Like, that's just stupid. You're not wittier than John Lennon. And this leads me to my next criticism, which you've probably already picked up on by now, but there's not a single Beatles song in this entire film. The crucial element that one might expect from a quasi-Beatles biopic, but nope, not on the cards. Now, that's not a problem with a film like Nowhere Boy, which takes place before the Beatles started writing tunes in earnest, but even they at least got it in spite of all the danger. And even with the songs that were included in the film, I was kind of disappointed with how the music sequences were shot. Like, say what you will about Backbeat from '94, sure, but that movie at least knew how to wrangle that manic energy of those early Beatle gigs with a kind of punk rock perspective that really lines up with the actual fever-pitch quality of how the band really sounded back then. But Midas Man fails to capture that same energy, like with Please Mr. Postman, a number that John absolutely slayed at, but here you're not getting any of that same ferocity. Like at this point in '62, the Beatles were so popular in Liverpool that this crowd should be a heaving, sweating mass of young people going spare at the band in front of them, but this is shot more like some sort of lame high school dance sequence. Part of that is the lackluster sound-alike cover that they're using, but much of it is due to how tepidly the sequence is directed, to the point where we as the audience wonder what the commotion of this band is even for. On a more positive note, I did enjoy how much the film leaned into the song Besame Mucho, an early number that I've always been very partial to. They used it in the trailer, and highlighted it for the EMI audition, which was one of the strongest scenes in the film, I thought. Massively helped by actually filming in Studio 2 of Abbey Road, and even then I still believe it could have used just a bit more punch.
More punch, George.
And the biggest issue with the lack of Beatles songs is the completely flaccid way the film ends. The finale revolves around the Our World broadcast, where to a global audience of 400 million people, the Beatles played their new song All You Need Is Love to unite humankind. The producers of Midas Man seemed to think that they could get the rights to at least this song, and so filmed an ending where the band plays the number to the 31 countries around the world, which would have been a lovely ending to the film. But because they never acquired the rights, we only see them setting up for the broadcast, and then the film just ends. What's the phrase? Not with a bang, but a whimper. Like, did anyone else find that when the film just ended, you just turned to whoever you were next to and you went, is that it? And now I just want to cap off my thoughts on the writing, because can we please address how lazy some of the dialogue is in this film? Like, at first I thought it was cute when during the first meeting in Brian's office, George picks up an object on his desk and says,
"Don't see many of these nowadays, do you?"
Which is taken directly from one of Harrison's lines in A Hard Day's Night.
You don't see many of these nowadays, do you?
But then they did it again.
I'd be quite prepared for that eventuality.
I'd be quite prepared for that eventuality.
And again.
I think I'll be leaving the band now.
Oh, I think I'll be leaving the band.
Georgia. It's just like, man, are they going to give this guy any original dialogue? I mean, sure, this is charming, but he barely has much to say in this film as it is. Like, come on, do the work. My other issue with the script is how it portrays a lack of character development. For example, after their first failed audition to get a record deal, John is suddenly very pissed off with Brian.
I just thought, it'd be best for your voices
if what? We're on different ties. We all bowed at exactly the same time. Why aren't you hopping on the chorus next time? Tune me guitar. No, wait, you can't do that, can you?
All right, John, come on, give him a break.
Now, this isn't unfaithful to how John actually felt during this stressful period where the band's future hung in the balance, but there's just zero lead up to it in the film. There's not really any relationship development between John and Brian to warrant this, and it just comes off as a bit jarring and out of nowhere. Maybe if we explored the more complex feelings these two had for each other, this scene would hit harder, but we don't, so it doesn't. And look, I know it's amateurish to critique a film for what it could have been, instead of solely reviewing what was delivered in the final product, but the whole narrative with Midas Man, from the original plea to investors to its bungled release rollout, is one of a missed opportunity, of not fulfilling something that had such massive potential. This review probably made it seem like I absolutely loathe this film, but I honestly didn't. It's competent enough and I enjoyed myself here and there, but what frustrated me about this film is that instead of an illuminating portrait of one of history's most fascinating figures, what we get instead is an unadventurous and bland biopic that never seems to grasp the importance and potential of the story being told. The actors deserved better, the audiences deserved better, but above all, Brian Epstein deserved better. Despite my belief that it was George Martin who was the true fifth Beatle, the band wouldn't have gone anywhere without the overwhelming dedication of Brian, the person who really believed in the Beatles' potential, who championed them in the same way we champion them now. In 2027, when the 4 official Beatles biopics have been released, Midas Man will have been entirely forgotten, and based on its hugely mismanaged release rollout, I think most have already forgotten about it now. Anyway, we love you, Brian. Here's to your memory. Hey everyone, well this video was a long time coming. For those of you who have seen Midas Man, what did you think? Was I being too harsh on this film? Was I not harsh enough? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget that my Patreon is now cheaper, where I have just so many bonus videos on there for you to enjoy. So hit the link in the description if you'd like to check them out and support me at the same time and be featured in the credits of every video too. And if you're not going to do that, at least hit subscribe, because I've got some more music biopic related videos in the pipeline, plus a big long-awaited video that I know you won't want to miss. Anyway, thanks for watching everyone. Hope you're all doing well, and I will see you soon. Bye bye.